a detective faced a calamity that implicated him in his friend's murder. He was innocent, but the police were unwilling to believe him. While in custody, he had to defend himself and solve the case. I was watching the torrential rain pouring down in front of my car's headlights, trying to drive very carefully. By late evening, I had already realized that tonight's journey would be quite challenging, but I hadn't expected the difficulties to start so soon. To distract myself from these challenges and potential troubles, I began thinking about Homer. When I resigned from my job at the police department in Philadelphia, Homer was a reporter for a major local newspaper. As a police officer, I was caught in a scandal that became nationally infamous as the school scandal. Among the entire journalist community, Homer was the only one who believed I wasn't actually involved in the scandal. My hands were clean, but the police department needed a scapegoat, and I became that scapegoat. Bitter and disheartened, I resigned. At that moment, Homer did something extraordinary. He resigned from his newspaper in support of me. As far as I know, this was the first time, not only in the country but perhaps in many countries, that a journalist resigned from a prominent newspaper in support of a police officer. After leaving the police department, I became a private detective, and Homer left his big city and prominent newspaper to settle in a small county in a lush green mountainous area. From there, he started a small local newspaper called Watchword, which soon gained credibility and reputation in 3 counties. At the time, I was traveling to Homer's area in my old car, and the autumn rain was making the journey difficult. The winding, tree-lined road to the valley had become slippery. The county Homer had chosen to live in was called Harry Whip. I was coming here for the first time, but Homer had explained the route and other necessary details to me over the phone the previous day. I was silently praying that the county had a livable motel, or that Homer had an extra room for me. I hadn't asked him about this on the phone, because I initially didn't plan to stay there. I was taking my first vacation toward the west, and thought I'd stop briefly on the way to meet my gracious, principled, and honorable friend. Following Homer's directions, I soon saw the Watchword office on the main road after entering the village. Its front wall was mostly glass, with the newspaper's name written in bold letters. Behind the glass, lights were visible. Homer had already informed me that he would be working late tonight, as he was preparing to break some important news. Working late wasn't an issue for him, as he lived alone and had his residence above the office. I parked my car in front of the first-floor office and stepped out into the pouring rain, bareheaded. Running, I crossed the sidewalk, climbed a few steps, and reached the office door. The next moment I froze in my tracks, not because of the cold mountain air, but because of what I saw inside through the glass wall. Inside, the small office contained all the essentials of a one-person-run newspaper. I barely glanced at the equipment. My eyes were fixed on Homer, lying flat near the desk where the large desktop computer was placed. Even from outside, in the rain, I could tell Homer wasn't alive. Part of his skull was missing, and there was a hole in the glass wall below a letter, W, with a spider web-like crack around it. The hole appeared to be caused by a .45 caliber revolver bullet. Though I realized there was nothing I could do for Homer now, the habit of being a police officer kicked in, and I immediately tried to turn the doorknob. It was locked. I stood there for a moment, stunned, wondering what to do next. Across the street, I noticed a light appearing in an upstairs window. Before I could properly turn my head to look, I heard a car engine starting at the end of an alley. Squinting into the darkness, I saw a car silhouette moving quickly away without its headlights on. However, when it reached the turn, its tail lights and brake lights came on. Only the left brake light illuminated. At that moment, the car's departure struck me as odd. Acting on instinct, I quickly got back into my car and started pursuing it. After crossing the bend where the car disappeared, I found myself in the central area of the county. The car was nowhere to be seen on the main road. Dim streetlights revealed some side alleys, but the wet road and sidewalks were deserted. Soon, I realized this county had a police station, and its officers were quite alert because standing in the middle of the road, with a large revolver pointed at my car, was a police officer. To avoid running him over, I slammed on the brakes, and the car screeched to a stop about 10 feet away. "Hands up! Get out of the car!" he shouted. These days, officers don't hesitate to fire for even minor mistakes, so I obediently followed his orders, raising my hands and stepping out of the car. "Place your hands on the roof of the car," he commanded. I complied. The car's roof felt as cold as the officer's tone. Freezing rainwater trickled down my collar. When he searched me, he only found my wallet. I'd left my gun back at my office. "Do you have any identification?" he asked flatly. "It's in my wallet," I replied. "Take it out and hand it to me," he said, giving me back the wallet. He seemed strict about following the rules. After examining my driver's license, he said, "Mr. Mangray, the police station is right behind me, nearby. You'll walk ahead of me with your hands visible at all times." "What about my car?" I asked. "I'll come back for it later," he replied. The police station was among a row of shops. It seemed like it had been converted from an old store. Someone was looking out the door, and upon seeing us, they opened the iron gate. The man at the door was a medium-height officer with a stocky build, gray streaks in his short hair, and an experienced, worldly face. "Chief, this is the man," the young officer behind me announced. "His car is white, with Pennsylvania plates," as the woman reported. "You acted quickly, Pinks," the chief praised him. Hearing the young officer's name as Pinks felt oddly unpleasant. No police officer should have such a name. The chief inspected my driver's license and then ordered, "Lock him up." "1 minute." "Listen to me," I stammered. "What crime am I being accused of?" "Fleeing the crime scene," the chief replied calmly. "For now, that charge will do. By the way, we can keep you locked up for over 24 hours. We have a woman's testimony. She saw you fleeing from the newspaper office where she spotted a body inside through the glass wall. She even noted your car's license plate. Then you were seen speeding through the town's central area. That's enough to hold you in custody. I remembered seeing a light in the window across the street while I was standing, frozen in shock, after seeing Homer's body. That anonymous old lady had certainly acted promptly in calling the police, and the young officer named Pinks had shown equal promptness in welcoming me. "Should I consider this an arrest?" I asked. "You can call it protective custody," the chief replied diplomatically. He was well versed in the law. Besides, in small towns and villages, police chiefs often reign supreme. I didn't argue further, and they ignored me anyway, locking me in a cell. "There's a thermos outside. If you want, you can pour yourself some coffee through the bars," the chief informed me. "We'll go investigate the crime scene." I heard the outer door lock, and the quiet of the night surrounded me as they left. That's when I remembered I had left home to go on vacation. A groan escaped my throat involuntarily. Nonetheless, missing out on coffee wouldn't be wise. I poured myself a cup through the bars and sat on the cot to think about the situation. The coffee was decent, but the circumstances were far from it. The only person who knew me in this small town was lying dead in his office, and that was why I was in custody. An overly diligent woman had provided testimony that could get me in serious trouble. The situation was bleak. The only silver lining was that I hadn't panicked or made a scene, shouting about my rights or threatening to get a lawyer to put the police in their place. People who do that usually convince the police of their guilt. After 9 o'clock, I heard a siren in the distance, likely signaling the arrival of a medical examiner at the crime scene. A while later, the chief returned, but Pinks wasn't with him. The chief hung his wet hat on a hook, came to my cell door and said, "This is the first time in my career we've arrested a suspect before visiting the crime scene. Are you ready to talk now, or not?" I've been ready to talk since the moment I was brought here, but no one seems to listen to me, I replied. He lit a cigarette and offered me one, but I refused. I had quit smoking a long time ago. Taking a long drag, he said, "All right, tell me your story." I narrated my story to him and then asked, "Didn't your subordinates, the ones patrolling, see the car pass by before I did?" If such a car even existed, it might have passed before they arrived, the chief replied. After observing me silently for a few moments, he said, "Your demeanor and way of talking make me suspicious. Are you a cop?" "I used to be. I was with the Philadelphia Police Department. Now I'm a private investigator," I said, extending my hand through the bars to show him my private investigator card. Even after looking at the card, his tone didn't change, and he didn't shake my hand. "What are you doing in Mars, Whip?" he asked. I explained the background and said, "I was coming to meet Homer. I still hold gratitude for him in my heart."